Imagine you are sitting in a glass-walled boardroom in Brussels on a rainy Tuesday morning in early 2026. The espresso in your small ceramic cup is stone cold. Outside, the gray sky hangs low over the city of bureaucrats and historic spires. On the massive oak table in front of you sits a stack of documents roughly the size of a phone book. This isn't a patent for a revolutionary clean energy engine or a blueprint for a new satellite. It is a compliance checklist for an artificial intelligence startup that hasn't even hired its 10th employee yet. Europe has spent the last few years drafting more rules for the future than it has actually building the future itself. It is a strange, quiet crisis. You probably thought that being the world's most sophisticated regulator was a position of supreme power. But as the hum of high-end silicon chips grows louder in California and Shenzhen, the silence in this room feels heavy. Why is the world's largest trade bloc slowly turning into a museum of great ideas rather than a factory for them? Here is the thing about the European economy in 2026. It is incredibly safe, remarkably stable, and increasingly irrelevant on the global tech stage. For decades, the Brussels effect was a point of pride. The idea was simple. If the European Union sets a strict standard for data privacy or chemical safety, the rest of the world follows because they want access to the European market. It worked for cars, and it worked for the internet in the early days. But something shifted around 2024 and 2025. Regulation stopped being a guide rail and started acting like a brick wall. When the EU AI Act finally hit its full implementation phase recently, the ripple effects were more like a tidal wave. Picture a typical boardroom meeting at a mid-sized tech firm in Berlin. The engineers are excited. They have found a way to use localized data to predict supply chain breaks before they happen. It could save billions, but the legal counsel raises a hand before the lead developer can even finish the slide deck. The conversation doesn't turn to, how do we make this faster, or how do we sell this to the world? Instead, the next 3 hours are spent discussing Article 6, Section 2 of a new directive. They talk about high-risk categorization and data provenance. They discuss the potential for a fine that could reach 7% of their total global turnover. By the time the meeting ends, the engineers look defeated. The spark of the idea has been smothered by a blanket of what if and we can't. Finance people still go back and forth on whether these rules actually protect consumers or just kill local business. Some argue that high standards create a premium market that people can trust. Others look at the data and see a vacuum. In early 2026, the gap between what a startup in Paris spends on lawyers versus what a startup in Austin spends on cloud computing is staggering. Reporting at the time suggested that European firms were spending up to 30% of their seed funding just on legal audits. That is money not spent on research. It is money not spent on hiring the best talent. It is the cost of doing business in a place that is terrified of making a mistake. Now look closer at the actual process of trying to launch something new. It is often described as death by 1,000 forms. You watch a founder in Stockholm open a laptop to register a new cloud service. In the United States, this might take an afternoon and a credit card. In the European Union of 2026, it involves a multi-step verification process across different jurisdictions. Even though it is supposed to be a single market, the reality on the ground feels fragmented. Every form requires a specific type of certification. Every server move requires a privacy impact assessment. It's like trying to run a sprint while wearing a suit of medieval armor. It's shiny and is very protective, but you aren't going to win any races. The tension in these rooms isn't just about paperwork, it's about a fundamental shift in how people view risk. In the American market, the culture is move fast and break things. In the Chinese market, it's move fast and scale things. In Europe, the culture has become move carefully and document things. This caution was born out of a desire to avoid the social media chaos of the 2000s and 10s. The intentions were good. Nobody wanted their personal data sold to the highest bidder without their consent. But the consequence was an innovation vacuum. When the big breakthroughs in generative video and autonomous logistics arrived in 2025, European companies were still waiting for clarification on whether they were allowed to train their models on specific datasets. By the time the OK came from Brussels, the rest of the world had already moved on to the next version. You notice the mood at the big tech conferences in Lisbon or Paris has changed. The stages are still beautiful. The lights are still bright. But the keynote speakers are increasingly visiting from overseas. They talk about the European market as a place to sell products, not a place to build them. It's a subtle but painful distinction. To the global tech giants, Europe is a wealthy neighborhood where the residents have very strict rules about the height of your hedges. They will pay for your services, but they won't let you build a workshop in your backyard. There was a notable moment in late 2025 during an earnings call for a major European industrial giant. The CEO was asked why their new automated factory was being built in South Carolina instead of the outskirts of Munich. The answer was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy, but the subtext was clear. He mentioned regulatory certainty and speed to market. In plain English, he meant that in the US, he could get the permits in 6 months, while in Europe, he was looking at 3 years of environmental and digital impact studies. That decision alone diverted €5 billion out of the European economy. It's not just one factory. It's the ecosystem that follows. It's the specialized mechanics, the software developers, and the local service providers who all lose out because the paperwork took too long. The reality check is that the world doesn't wait for permission anymore. While the EU was debating the ethics of AI, a dozen companies in Asia were already integrating it into their national power grids. The innovation vacuum isn't a single event. It's the space left behind when the brightest minds realize that the path of least resistance leads away from home. Some analysts argue that this is the price of a civilized society. They say that protecting the individual is more important than creating the next trillion-dollar company. But as the 2026 budget cycles begin, the math is getting harder to ignore. Without the growth that comes from innovation, the very social safety nets Europe is trying to protect are starting to fray. You see it in the venture capital numbers too. The amount of dry powder, cash waiting to be invested, is at record highs in Europe, but the money is staying in the bank. Investors are hesitant to put their capital into a company that might be regulated out of existence before its second birthday. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The rules are meant to create a stable environment for investment, but they are so complex that they create the very instability they were meant to prevent. The result is a continent that is very good at maintaining what it already has, but very bad at imagining what comes next. As you look around that boardroom in Brussels one last time, you realize the documents on the table aren't just rules. They are the weight of a continent trying to hold back the tide with a clipboard. The departure lounge at Heathrow Terminal 5 in late 2025 has a very specific kind of energy. It is not the frantic buzz of tourists headed for the Mediterranean. It is a quieter, more calculated movement of people. You stand near the gate for a direct flight to Austin, Texas, and you see it in their faces. These are the engineers, the biotech researchers, and the software architects in their late 20s and early 30s. They are carrying backpacks stuffed with high-end laptops and one-way tickets. This isn't a vacation. This is a mass migration of brainpower. The data from 2025 showed a record-breaking number of advanced degree holders leaving the continent. It's like watching a high-stakes poker game, where one player keeps folding every winning hand until the other players just get up and leave the table. Here's the thing about talent. It goes where it is celebrated, not just where it is tolerated. For a long time, Europe relied on its high quality of life to keep people around. The 5 weeks of vacation and the beautiful historic city centers were a powerful magnet. But in the hyper-fast world of 2026, those perks have started to lose their shine for people who want to change the world. If you are a coder who has developed a new way to optimize quantum encryption, you don't care about a scenic commute. You care about whether you can get the $5 million you need to buy server time without spending 6 months in a regulatory sandbox. The contrast in the venture capital world is almost comical. Imagine a meeting in a posh office in London's Mayfair. The room is filled with dark wood and quiet voices. The founder presents a plan for a decentralized energy grid. The investors listen politely, nodding their heads. But then come the questions. They ask about the upcoming EU directive on blockchain energy. They ask about the maybe from the local utility commission. They suggest a smaller pilot program that will take 2 years to complete. It is a culture of caution. The maybe is the most dangerous word in European finance. It is a slow, polite death for a startup. It's like trying to start a fire with damp wood. You get a lot of smoke, but you never get the heat. Now compare that to a meeting in a glass and steel building in Singapore or a noisy coffee shop in Austin. The vibe is completely different. The investor doesn't ask about the regulator first. They ask how fast the team can scale. They ask how much more money is needed to crush the competition in 6 months. In those ecosystems, the yes is loud and the capital is aggressive. By the time the European founder has finished their third round of compliance checks, their American or Asian counterpart has already secured Series B funding. They have hired 50 more people. They have captured the market. This isn't just about money, it's about the velocity of the yes. Analysts still argue about whether the generous European welfare state effectively subsidizes the global tech industry by training engineers who then leave. It's a fascinating, if painful, debate. Think about it. A student in France or Germany gets a world-class education that is largely funded by the taxpayer. They become an expert in machine learning or genomics, but as soon as they have the skills to build something massive, they realize the local environment is too restrictive, so they move to the US or China. Europe pays for the training, and other countries reap the economic rewards. It is one of the most expensive gift-giving programs in history. It is a constant transfer of human capital that is worth enough cash to fill a fleet of cargo ships. You hear the same story over and over again in the 2026 tech hubs. A researcher from Milan mentions how they tried to get a grant for a new carbon capture tech. They spent 4 months filling out paperwork that required them to prove the social inclusion impact of a chemical process. It was the breaking point. They realized that their energy was being spent on bureaucracy rather than chemistry. Now they are working in a lab in California where the only thing that matters is the carbon count per hour. You might think this is just a few disgruntled individuals. But when you multiply that by tens of thousands of top-tier professionals, you get a hole in the economy that is impossible to fill. There is a real psychological weight to this drain. When the most ambitious people leave a room, the average ambition of the people staying behind drops. It creates a feedback loop of mediocrity. In 2025, the phrase European scale started to become a bit of a joke in the Valley. It meant something that was safe, small, and probably wouldn't bother anyone. The brain drain isn't just a headline in a financial newspaper. It is a series of quiet decisions made at kitchen tables in Barcelona and Krakow. It's a young couple deciding that their future looks brighter in a place where they don't have to apologize for wanting to get rich. You watch them sign the leases for their new offices in Shenzhen or Boston, and you realize the cost is more than just tax revenue. It's the missing companies. It's the 2026 versions of Google or Amazon that were supposed to be founded in Berlin, but are now being founded in Palo Alto. Reporting at the time suggested that for every one high-tech job created in Europe, 3 were being created by European expats abroad. It is a staggering leakage of potential. The continent is essentially exporting its future to pay for its present. The reality of the safety net is also complicated. We often hear that the safety net encourages risk because people know they won't starve if they fail. That sounds great on paper, but in practice, the 2026 landscape shows something different. The safety net in Europe is often tied to traditional, stable employment. If you leave your job to start a company, you often lose many of those protections. Meanwhile, the high taxes required to fund that net mean there is less private wealth available for early-stage angel investing. It's a paradox. The system designed to protect people sometimes ends up trapping them in the status quo. The tension hits a peak when you look at the moonshot projects. These are the ideas that have a 90% chance of failing but could change everything if they work. In Europe, a 90% failure rate is seen as a waste of our public funds. In the US, it's seen as a Tuesday. This fundamental disagreement on the value of failure is what truly drives the talent away. If you are a young scientist with a wild idea, you want to be in a place where failure is a badge of honor, not a legal liability. You track the capital and you see the trend line is a steep slide. The investment into European-founded startups that have stayed in Europe is stagnant. Meanwhile, the investment into European-founded startups that moved to the US has tripled in the last 18 months. It is a clear signal from the market. The investors aren't betting against European brains. They are betting against the European environment. The innovation vacuum isn't just a lack of ideas. It is an empty space where those ideas used to be before they hopped on a plane. As the sun sets over the tarmac at Heathrow, another flight takes off for the West. On board are the people who will design the next generation of medical AI and the next breakthrough in solid-state batteries. They are leaving behind the cafes, the cathedrals, and the compliance forms. They are heading toward a place that moves as fast as they do. You realize the true crisis of 2026 isn't just about the rules. It's about the fact that the people who should be breaking those rules have already left the building. Picture a massive industrial hall in the heart of Germany's Ruhr Valley. For nearly a century, this place was a cathedral of noise. You would have heard the rhythmic thumping of steel presses and the constant hiss of high-pressure steam. It was the sound of the European engine at full throttle. But in the early months of 2026, the silence in this building is so thick it feels physical. The machines are still there, polished and perfectly maintained, but they are cold. Dust has started to settle on the control panels. A single security guard walks the perimeter, his footsteps echoing off the corrugated metal walls. This isn't just one factory closing down, it is a scene playing out across northern Italy, eastern France, and the industrial heartlands of the continent. The 2026 energy reality has turned these powerhouses into high-tech ghost towns. Here's the thing about heavy industry. It doesn't just need smart people, it needs cheap, reliable power. For decades, Europe built its middle class on the back of affordable energy imports. When that model broke in the early 2000s, everyone hoped it was a temporary shock. People talked about a bridge to a green future. But as 2026 rolled around, that bridge turned out to be much longer and more expensive than anyone predicted. Today, a chemical plant in Ludwigshafen pays roughly 3 to 4 times more for its energy than a competitor on the Gulf Coast of Texas. When your profit margins are thin, that isn't just a hurdle. It is a death sentence. Economists still debate whether the rapid green transition was a visionary leap or a premature gamble that left industry exposed. It's a polarizing topic in every cafe from Berlin to Brussels. On one hand, Europe has more installed solar and wind capacity than ever before. On a sunny, windy day, the price of electricity can actually drop below zero. But you can't run a glass furnace or a steel mill only when the sun is shining. These businesses need a constant, massive flow of power, 24 hours a day. The cost of the batteries and the grid upgrades needed to manage that green flow has been passed straight to the consumer. For a small parts manufacturer, a monthly utility bill now looks more like a mortgage payment for a skyscraper. Now, look at the solar paradox. You notice that even as the cost of solar panels dropped, the price of electricity for the average factory actually went up. It sounds like a mistake, but the math is brutal. Because the old coal and gas plants are being phased out, the baseload power that keeps the lights on at 3 a.m. is becoming incredibly scarce. To keep the grid stable, the government has to pay massive subsidies to keep some gas plants on standby. Those costs show up on the invoices of every business on the continent. It's a strange reality where having more free energy from the sun actually makes the total system more expensive to run. There was a telling moment in an earnings call for a major automotive supplier in early 2026. The CEO was asked about their plans for a new battery factory in Poland. He didn't talk about labor costs or taxes. He pulled up a chart showing the projected cost of natural gas for the next 5 years. He pointed out that the cost of drying the battery electrodes in Europe was so high that it wiped out any savings from local production. "We want to build here," he said, "but we can't ignore the laws of physics and finance." A few weeks later, the company announced a new site in Georgia. Not the country, but the American state. That single decision meant 2,000 high-paying jobs vanished from the European map. You watch the shift in investor behavior, and it's like watching a slow-motion migration. The big institutional funds are quietly pivoting away from old-world, heavy industry. They aren't putting their money into German steel or French chemicals anymore. Instead, they are looking for new world tech that doesn't rely on the power grid. They are chasing software, fintech, and digital services. But here's the problem. You can't build a whole economy on apps and banking alone. You need a physical foundation. When the factories go silent, the local shops, the logistics companies, and the technical colleges all start to wither. It is a chain reaction of decline. Meanwhile, the geopolitical reality is biting hard. While Europe was busy decommissioning its older power sources, its global competitors were doubling down on whatever worked. In 2025, reports showed that China was adding more coal power while simultaneously leading in renewables. They were doing everything at once. The US was using its own shale gas to keep its industrial base humming. Europe, caught in the middle, tried to be the moral leader of the climate movement. It's a noble goal, but as one frustrated factory owner in Milan put it, you can't pay your workers with moral leadership. The tension in the manufacturing sector is reaching a boiling point. You see protests in the streets, but they aren't just about wages. They are about the right to produce. There is a growing sense of anger that the continent is being deindustrialized by design. People are starting to realize that the 2026 innovation vacuum isn't just about missing the next AI boom. It's about losing the ability to make physical things. When a country stops making its own glass, its own steel, and its own chemicals, it loses its strategic autonomy. It becomes a customer rather than a creator. Zoom out for a second and look at the broader landscape. The high energy costs have created a sorting effect. Only the most high-margin, ultra-luxury products can survive the European power bill. You can still make a $100,000 watch or a luxury sports car in Europe because the energy cost is a tiny fraction of the sale price. But you can't make the basic components for a washing machine or a solar panel. The middle of the industrial economy is being hollowed out. It is leaving behind a society of highs and lows with nothing in between. The most verifiable sign of this struggle is the Industrial Production Index. By mid-2026, the numbers for the Eurozone had hit a multi-year low. It wasn't a sudden crash like a pandemic. It was a steady, grinding erosion. It's like watching a once great athlete slowly lose their breath. Every month, a few more jobs are lost. Every quarter, another specialized workshop closes its doors. These are businesses that have been in families for generations. They survived world wars and depressions, but they couldn't survive the 2026 energy bill. The debate in the media is often framed as environment versus economy, but that's a simplification. The real struggle is about innovation. If Europe had been the leader in next-generation nuclear or advanced grid storage, the story would be different. But because the regulatory environment was so hostile to risky new energy tech, the continent stayed stuck with old solutions that are now too expensive. The innovation vacuum in tech led directly to an innovation vacuum in energy. As you walk out of that silent factory in the Ruhr Valley, you see the For Lease sign being hammered into the ground. It's a high-end sign made of recycled plastic and printed with eco-friendly ink. It is perfectly compliant with every local regulation, but it is still a sign of failure. The lights are off, the workers are gone, and the future is being built somewhere else where the power is cheap and the ambition is high. The industrial ghost towns of 2026 are a haunting reminder that a continent cannot live on rules alone. If you look at a map of the European Union in 2026, it looks like one solid, colorful block. It is a massive territory with nearly 450 million relatively wealthy consumers. On paper, it is a dream market for any entrepreneur. But if you were to overlay a map of the actual digital regulations, tax codes, and labor laws, that solid block would shatter into 27 jagged pieces. This is the fragmentation trap. It is the hidden wall that prevents a small company in Lisbon from ever becoming a giant in Berlin. While American and Chinese companies scale across their massive, unified home markets, European firms are stuck playing a game of 27 different versions of chess at the same time. Here's the thing about the single market of 2026. It is very effective for shipping physical crates of oranges or car parts. But for the digital economy, the single market is often a polite fiction. Imagine a young team in Tallinn, Estonia. They have built a revolutionary app that uses AI to manage personal finances. It is a hit at home. They want to expand. In the United States, that move would involve a few server upgrades and a localized ad campaign. But for this Estonian team, moving into France means hiring a French legal team to navigate specific consumer protection nuances. Moving into Germany means a different set of data storage requirements. By the time they have cleared the hurdles for 5 countries, they have spent their entire expansion budget on lawyers instead of engineers. There's still a real disagreement on whether this diversity is a cultural strength or an economic weight. Some argue that 27 different sets of rules allow for localized perfection. They believe that a citizen in Rome should have different digital rights than a citizen in Warsaw. But in the world of venture capital, this is seen as a fatal flaw. Investors look for scalability. They want to see a company that can go from 1 million users to 100 million users without reinventing the wheel every time they cross a border. In 2025 and 2026, the data showed that European startups were 5 times more likely to stall after their first year of growth compared to their American peers. They simply run out of breath trying to climb over 27 different walls. Now, consider the linguistic and legal labyrinth. You watch a developer in Madrid trying to launch a new health tech platform. It isn't just about translating the app into 20 different languages. That is the easy part. The hard part is that the health regulations in Sweden are fundamentally different from the ones in Greece. Every time this developer enters a new market, they have to re-verify their data protocols. They have to renegotiate with local insurance providers. It is a friction-filled process that slows everything down. By the time they are European-wide, a competitor from Silicon Valley has already launched a global version that is good enough for everyone. This leads to a harsh reality. Many US and Chinese firms now treat Europe as a museum rather than a market. Picture a board meeting in a high-rise in Shanghai or a campus in Mountain View. The executives are looking at a world map. They see the rapid growth in Southeast Asia. They see the massive unified consumer base in North America. When they look at Europe, they see a high-income region with low growth and high compliance friction. Often, the decision is made to simply wait and see. They might launch a stripped-down version of their product in Europe just to keep a footprint, but they don't invest their best talent there. They don't see it as the place where the future is being built. They see it as a place to sell luxury goods and collect heritage fees. You notice this most clearly in the filing rooms of major tech giants. In 2026, some of these companies have larger legal departments for their European operations than they have engineering departments. Filings from early 2026 showed that one major social media platform spent more on EU compliance than on the development of its entire next-generation hardware suite. That is a staggering allocation of resources. It means that the best minds in the company are being used to avoid fines rather than to invent new technologies. To an outside investor, this looks like a company in defensive mode. It is the opposite of innovation. The fragmentation trap also affects how capital moves. Because there is no unified capital markets union, it is very hard for a pension fund in Spain to invest in a startup in Finland. The financial plumbing is just too complex. This means that European startups often lack the deep pockets needed to survive the middle years of growth. They can get a little bit of seed money locally, but when they need 100 million euros to go big, they have to look toward New York or London. And usually, when that American money comes in, it comes with a condition. The company has to move its headquarters to the US. It is a slow, steady draining of the most promising European businesses. Then there is the issue of digital sovereignty. This was a big buzzword in Brussels throughout 2024 and 2025. The idea was that Europe should build its own cloud services and its own search engines so it wouldn't be dependent on foreign tech. But here's the problem. You can't build a sovereign cloud if the market is too fragmented to support it. A French cloud service that only works well in France will never have the scale to compete with global giants. Without scale, the prices are higher and the technology is slower. The very rules meant to protect sovereignty often end up making European businesses more dependent on foreign tech because the local alternatives are too small and too expensive. You see the result of this in the innovation vacuum of 2026. While the world is moving toward integrated AI-driven economies, Europe is still debating how to make 27 different national tax systems talk to each other. It is like trying to build a modern, high-speed rail network, but every few miles the tracks change gauge and you have to change trains. It is technically possible, but it is so inefficient that nobody wants to use it. The momentum is lost. The excitement is replaced by frustration. There was a notable micro-scene during a 2026 tech summit in Paris. A prominent investor was asked why they stopped funding European e-commerce companies. They didn't point to a lack of talent. They pointed to a stack of papers. They explained that to sell a single product across the entire EU, their portfolio companies had to deal with varying VAT rates, different return policies, and unique packaging requirements for almost every country. It's not a single market, they said. It's a collection of boutique shops. That quote went viral in the European tech community because it hit a nerve. It perfectly captured the feeling of being trapped in a small room while the rest of the world is out in the open field. This fragmentation is why there is no European Google or Amazon. It's not that Europeans aren't smart enough or creative enough. It's that the environment is designed to keep things small. It is an ecosystem that rewards the safe and local over the bold and continental. In the 2026 innovation vacuum, the space that should have been filled by a European tech giant is instead filled by foreign companies that have the scale to handle the complexity. You realize that the 27 borders might be invisible on a modern map, but in the world of 2026 finance, they are made of solid concrete. The headlines in early 2026 hit the newsstands like a bucket of cold water. One major financial paper across the continent ran a front page that simply said, "The Innovation Vacuum." It wasn't just a catchy title. It was a summary of a brutal reality that had been building for years. Reports released that month showed that for the first time in modern history, not a single European company was ranked in the top 50 most valuable technology firms globally. This wasn't just about missing a trend. This was a structural erasure. You watch the news cycle churn through the numbers, and the feeling is one of profound, quiet shock. It is the moment a continent realizes that being the world's most sophisticated regulator doesn't mean much if there is nothing left to regulate. A few weeks later, an emergency summit was called in Brussels. The atmosphere in the Justus Lipsius building was far from the usual diplomatic polish. The hallways, usually filled with the sound of measured compromise, felt tight with anxiety. Leaders from the 27 member states gathered around a massive table, looking at a set of projections that looked like a freefall. The data was undeniable. Productivity was stalling, the talent was gone, and the energy bills were gutting what was left of the industrial base. This was the 2026 wake-up call. It was the moment the Brussels effect finally stopped being a source of pride and started being treated as a potential suicide note. Finance people still go back and forth on whether it is even possible to fix a ship this large while it is already taking on water. Some analysts at the summit argued that the only way out was a scorched earth approach to regulation, a radical slashing of the rules to invite the world back in. Others were terrified that doing so would destroy the very social fabric that makes Europe what it is. It is a high-stakes disagreement that has no easy answer. But the tension in the room suggested that the time for balanced approaches had run out. You notice the shift in the language. They aren't talking about strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty anymore. They are talking about survival. There was a notable moment during a late-night session when a leaked memo from a major central bank started circulating among the delegates. The memo used a phrase that would haunt the headlines for months, the theme park economy. It argued that without a radical pivot, Europe was on track to become a beautiful, historic playground for the rest of the world's wealthy. A place where people come to look at old buildings, eat nice food, and enjoy the scenery, but where no one actually builds anything new. It was a stinging critique. It suggested that the continent was trading its future for a comfortable retirement. Now look closer at the actual decisions being made in that room. The pivot toward survival started with a series of innovation sandboxes. These were designated zones where the usual rules of the 2024 AI Act and the various data directives would be suspended for 5 years. The idea was to create small patches of Texas-style deregulation inside the heart of Europe. It was a desperate move. It was an admission that the existing system was incompatible with the speed of the 2026 tech landscape. You watch the frantic attempts to lure back the founders who had left for Singapore and Austin. They offered tax holidays and bureaucracy-free fast tracks. But the response from the tech community was skeptical. Trust is easy to break and very hard to rebuild. The reality check came from the markets themselves. While Brussels was debating these new zones, the global capital flows continued to move toward the US and China. The innovation vacuum had created a gravity of its own. Because there were no major European platforms to invest in, the local wealth continued to seek returns elsewhere. Even the European sovereign wealth funds were putting their capital into Silicon Valley startups. It is a bitter irony. The continent's own savings were being used to fund the competitors that were putting European factories out of business. Analysts still argue about whether this 2026 crisis was an inevitable result of the safety-first culture, or if it could have been avoided with better leadership. Some point back to the 2024 Draghi report, which warned that Europe needed an extra 800 billion euros a year in investment just to stay relevant. At the time, the report was seen as alarmist. By 2026, it looked like an understatement. The gap hadn't just remained, it had widened into a canyon. The radical pivot towards survival involved a massive, centralized push to fund deep tech, robotics, quantum computing, and next-gen energy. But as any venture capitalist will tell you, you can't just throw money at a vacuum and expect a company to appear. You need the culture to go with it. The most verifiable moment of this shift was the 2026 competitiveness mandate. It was a piece of emergency legislation that officially prioritized economic growth over regulatory precaution for the first time in the union's history. It was a total reversal of the philosophy of the previous decade. It was the moment the regulators finally put down the clipboards and picked up the shovels. It was a move born out of pure, unadulterated fear. The fear that by 2030, the European economy would be smaller than that of a single American state. You track the reactions from the public, and they are deeply divided. In the university towns, there is a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, they won't have to move to the US to get a job. In the industrial heartlands, there is a weary cynicism. They have heard revitalization plans before. They want to see the lights come back on in the factories, not just new posters in the subway stations. The 2026 innovation vacuum has left a scar on the collective psyche. It is the realization that progress isn't a natural right. It is something that has to be fought for every single day. As the summit concluded, the leaders stepped out into the grey Brussels afternoon. There were no grand victory speeches. There were only tired faces and a long list of tasks. The innovation vacuum hadn't been filled yet, but the silence had finally been broken. The choice was clear. Either the continent would find a way to become a laboratory for the future again, or it would settle into its role as the world's most beautiful museum. The 2026 wake-up call was the start of a long, difficult journey back to relevance. It remains to be seen if the ship can turn in time to avoid the rocks. The story of Europe's 2026 innovation vacuum is still being written in real time. It's a complex puzzle of high-level policy and personal ambition, and there are no simple villains or heroes in this narrative. It is a story about what happens when a society prioritizes stability so much that it forgets how to grow. Whether the recent shifts in Brussels will be enough to spark a new renaissance, or if they are just a temporary reaction to a permanent decline, is something we will all be watching closely over the next few years. I would love to hear your take on this. Where are you watching this from? And what does the economic situation look like in your part of the world right now? Are you seeing similar trends in your local industry? Or does the future look a bit brighter from where you are sitting? Please let me know what your plans are for navigating these shifting global markets in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the 2026 innovation crisis helpful, it would mean a lot if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep these stories going and ensures you won't miss our next look at the forces shaping our world. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.